I'll be speaking to the former BBC news broadcaster, Nicholas Owen. Finally, in this first hour, as the conflict in the Middle East continues, the conduct of each side is routinely denounced as a war crime. But Israel has broken the habit of decades and decided to defend itself in the International Court of Justice against a charge of genocide brought by South Africa. A barrister and director of UK Lawyers for Israel will join me to explain the legal complexities. All of that to come. But first, your news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Very good morning. It's just after 11 o'clock. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has denied having hesitations about the government's scheme to send asylum seekers to Rwanda when he was Chancellor. The BBC claims to have seen documents where Rishi Sunak expressed scepticism about the plan, stating that the deterrent won't work. The documents also show that he wanted to pursue smaller volumes initially, flying 500 people to Rwanda in the first year of the scheme, instead of the proposed 1,500. But, speaking a little earlier, the Prime Minister said it was his job to ask probing questions about every policy that came across his desk. Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, says the Prime Minister's plan is the deterrent the UK needs.
I am sure that he was asking a lot of questions about the policy, but look at his actions, look what he's done. You know, he's introduced the illegal migration bill into the House of Commons, the Rwanda bill, which will introduce Rwanda to this country and will mean that we overturn the issues that were raised by the Court of Appeal. It will mean that flights can take off to Rwanda, which we think is incredibly important because we know deterrence works. We've seen what happened with the Albania deal, where they do get returned to their country of origin.
However, Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson says the plan won't work.
It's far from clear whether the plan will have sent anyone to Rwanda because, we've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than we have asylum seekers. And even if Rwanda were to be an effective intervention, well, even if it were to be effective, you're talking about between 100 to 200 asylum seekers. It's 1% of the backlog of claims that we're facing at the moment. So it's just not the answer. It's a gimmick. What we need to have is a serious plan, as Labour has set out, around tackling those cases, that huge backlog of cases, and ending the use of inappropriate accommodation such as hotels.
The Environment Agency is warning that flooding will continue during the next week as river levels remain high. More than 1,800 properties have already flooded, with residents around the rivers Trent, Severn and Thames still at high risk. Nearly 200 flood warnings remain in place in England, with possible travel disruption in the South, Yorkshire and the Humber. Communities Secretary Michael Gove and Environment Secretary Steve Barclay have announced funding and tax relief for those communities affected. Labour's attacked the government's response, saying they've been asleep at the wheel. A watchdog is looking into claims that Pensions Minister Paul Maynard broke parliamentary rules by using taxpayer money to pay for Conservative Party work. Mr Maynard has been referred to the expenses watchdog after a report revealed that donors to the party had to deposit contributions to his personal account and staff rather than the local constituency association. The Sunday Times also claims that Mr Maynard claimed rent for an office that doubles up as his local Tory association's headquarters. The Lib Dems are urging the Prime Minister to remove him as minister while the allegations are investigated. The Blackpool North and Clevedale's MP denies the claims. The UK is set to invest £300 million in fuel to power the next generation of nuclear reactors. The funding will support domestic production of uranium fuel required by most reactors and currently only commercially produced by Russia. The government hopes the programme would allow the supply of reactor fuel to the rest of the world and help to further isolate Moscow. Another £10 million will also be provided to develop the skills and sites to produce other nuclear fuels in the UK. Dozens of planes have been grounded in America after a window and part of the fuselage blew out of an Alaska Airlines plane in mid-air. The Alaska Airlines aircraft was forced to make an emergency landing after a hole appeared where the emergency exit had been. 177 people were on board. No one's been hurt. The US airline regulator has ordered inspections of 171 Boeing 737 MAX 9 jets. The UK's Civil Aviation Authority have confirmed that the aircraft are not registered in the UK. A probe carrying British technology is preparing to blast off into space tomorrow in what could be a first for a private company. The Peregrine Mission 1, built by the US space company Astrobotic, will attempt to land on the lunar surface. The spacecraft is set to be one of the first US moon landings since the final Apollo mission more than 50 years ago. On board will be a sensor developed by UK scientists, which will analyse the thin lunar atmosphere and find out more about how water might be moving around the moon. Back here on Earth, this is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you, Pip Thompson. The new year began with a flurry of political messaging from the political parties as they position themselves for the general election, which the Prime Minister says will be held in the second half of this year. Rishi Sunak says you should vote Tory to avoid higher taxes, even though under his watch the tax burden is the highest that it has been since the Second World War. Sir Keir Starmer delivered a message of renewal, whilst regurgitating platitudes that offered little clue about how policy might change. The former business executive Richard Tice may have deployed his boardroom skills when delivering a PowerPoint presentation at Reform's press conference, but I found it hard to take his generalisations seriously. The message that the Liberal Democrats did not intend to send is that their leader, Ed Davey, when a minister, refused to meet the sub-postmasters to address the injustice of historic proportions that was done to them. And the Scottish Nationalists have apparently raised only £10,000 in donations since Humza Yousaf became their leader. So how will it pay its bills? Here to give me their thoughts on New Year politics is former Conservative advisor and speechwriter Peter Franklin, the economist Vicky Price, and the pollster and political scientist Matt Goodwin, who's very kindly stepped in after disruption on the trains prevented Aubrey Allegretti from reaching us today. Vicky, you are principally, of course, an economist, but would you mind answering about Ed Davey? These allegations today that he was repeatedly sent requests for meeting with the sub-postmasters by Alan Bates, who's now become a rather national figure thanks to the ITV drama, these allegations are going to do him some damage, are they not?
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, that a minister listens to whoever it is who's advising them. So we have a special advisor here, but also the staff in the department would have told him that this is a post office issue, the post office has told us this, so there isn't any point in doing so, particularly, of course, since the coalition had just been formed at the time. But the whole issue has lasted for so much longer than that. This is not just a 2010-2012 issue, which is when Ed Davey was at the Department for whatever it was called in those days, Business, Innovation and Skills, or maybe it had changed its name. It's changed its name so often. I used to work for it myself, of course.
Yes.
But the issue is what was being told to those advisors, because, of course, you know, things are one step removed. If you are running a department, there are a number of agencies, a number of organisations that, if you like, belong to that department. But there is a huge amount of autonomy that is allowed, and that is, I think, the problem.
I used to be a minister, and I disagree with you about the definition of a minister. I don't think a minister is there just to listen to advisors and take advice. I think a minister should be willing to step back. I mean, what we had was a situation where over years and years and years, not many sub-postmasters had committed fraud. Suddenly there are 700 prosecutions, and nobody, including the minister, thinks, hello, this is extraordinary and simply cannot be explained in the way that it's being explained to me.
Well, it's interesting, of course, again, that so much of what was going on has now been made a lot more public because of the ITV series that everybody has been watching. And it is absolutely extraordinary. I think there is no justification for what was going on. There's no justification for the whole thing lasting for so long without proper compensation. There's no justification for the Post Office wanting to argue that a number of the convictions should not be thrown out. So I think there are moves finally. But the question is why? I mean, after all, the Tories have been in power for quite some time, and yet we're still at the point where it is a scandal which hasn't been dealt with. And you can add to that, of course, the whole contaminated blood scandal, which is still with us. So it seems to me we're just not...
Tower.
Yeah, exactly. We're not dealing with things properly. And whether it's a ministerial issue, whether it's a a government civil service issue or whether it is we can't admit to any mistakes, which is one of the things that permeates, I'm afraid, the civil service, and lots of organisations are out there, and that's a real problem.
It's ghastly. Peter, let's bring this particular issue firmly back to politics. Ed Davey, every time he appears during the general election, is going to be dogged by this question, isn't he?
He will. I mean, if you remember, a couple of general elections ago, there was another Lib Dem leader who was dogged non-stop about his Christian beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. Different issue. But it's a Lib Dem. No one actually cares about your policy ideas. What they'll do is find some interesting nugget to hound the person on, and this will be the nugget this time. Unless this is dealt with, the Lib Dems can forget about their election communication plans, because as things stand, they're wiped out, unless something is done to kill off this issue. Which would be a very considerable relief to many Tory MPs who at the moment are thinking they're going to be losing to Liberal Democrats. Let us then turn to the Tories. So here is Rishi, Peter, thinking that he can fight an election promising lower taxes with this tremendous tax burden that we have that I just alluded to, still clinging to Rwanda. And, you know, with the best will in the world, even if it succeeds, it's not going to succeed, if you understand the paradox. Even if he manages to send people abroad, it's not going to provide the deterrent effects that he hopes. Did you find his New Year message realistic? No, totally unrealistic, I'm afraid. And I say that as someone with a Conservative background who voted for him above Liz Truss. But I've been deeply disappointed by his performance. And, the penny dropped actually this time last year with his 5 pledges, which were vapid, weren't actually about deep policy change.
They managed to be both vapid and too precise. In other words, although they were vapid, it was possible to fail to achieve most of them.
Yes, which looks like the case. And yes, he's got he seems to have ruled out the spring election, but he's still got to fight the local elections. And if they are a disaster, they could end his leadership just as they ended Theresa May's leadership in 2019.
Matt, are we being realistic in thinking that something that a Liberal Democrat did some years ago, which nonetheless has come to light thanks to an ITV drama, that this could affect the polls?
I think it could, yeah. I mean, the Lib Dems are already struggling. They're, as of this morning, in the polling we did for GBNews, they're on 11%, equal to Reform. So their historic status as the main alternative to the big two parties, I think, is under threat from this resurgent Reform Party. So, yeah, this could be a really big problem. But also, just on this Conservative point, I don't think Rishi Sunak understands just how weak his party is. I mean, on the current polling numbers, the Conservatives are down to 150 seats. Now, you'll remember 97 and 2001. That is roughly...
Particularly 97, oddly enough.
That is roughly where we are. But Michael...
Well, I think we were at 165 then, so, I mean, it's a good deal worse than that, actually.
Yeah, so we're going to see a whole generation of frontline, prominent Conservatives, dare I say, experiencing their own Portillo moment on election night, really suffering to this sense out there in the country that the Conservatives don't have a plan.
What did you make of Sir Keir Starmer? I mean... There he was, full of confidence. He obviously is pretty confident that he's going to become Prime Minister, but really with no details at all, and very happy to go for generalisations, talking about his mission and things like that, but nothing precise whatsoever.
No, I think the blunt reality is actually Keir Starmer's in a very lucky, fortunate position. He doesn't actually have to set out big, bold, ambitious, detailed policy proposals. He just has to wait, essentially, for this election to happen and be called, and Labour will win by default because of the public mood in the country, because we're in a first-past-the-post system. By the way, Michael, they'll make big gains in Scotland too, something people aren't yet tuning into. They'll win back on current poll numbers every single seat in the Red Wall. Now, what's interesting for Labour from my perspective is what's going to happen after they win that election, because I would bet, and Vicky will probably know more about this than me, but I would bet they then have to break many of their manifesto pledges. I think taxes are going to have to go up. I don't think they're going to get in control of the immigration issue. I don't think the illegal migration plan they've set out is realistic. I think the debt in this country is going to increasingly restrict the amount of room that a Labour government will have. And so I think it's not so much what do Labour need to do to win the election, but what are they going to have to do to stay in power for a significant period of time, because I could see that Labour government unravelling pretty quickly.
You mentioned Scotland in passing. I'm very tuned into Scotland. It's just interesting, isn't it, that it's quite a complex situation with many moving parts. The SNP is weak, therefore Labour get more seats in Scotland. The Liberal Democrats are weak and possibly going to get weaker. So some Conservative seats that might have been lost will not be lost. Reform appears to be getting stronger. What that means is not that the Conservatives will lose seats to Reform, but rather that Labour will probably win more seats. Is that so?
Broadly, yes, Reform are taking close to 1 in 4 of 2019 Conservative Party voters. So the Conservatives are being squeezed on 3 fronts, by Reform, by Labour and by apathy, by 2019 Conservatives not voting at all.
Vicky, what will the economy be doing this year, and how will the movements in the economy help the parties?
It's very interesting that we've had the national insurance contributions cut happening in January. So when we saw that, we thought perhaps that would mean an early election. Or it takes perhaps a little bit of time for that to filter through to people feeling a little bit richer. So it had to be done quite early. Plus, of course, we had the announcement of the March budget being on the 6th, which is very early. So again, there were all these speculations that we're going to have an early election. But of course, it takes time for some of those cuts to filter through to people's feeling of well-being, being actually quite an important one, which it's not going to happen for some time. And of course, we still have the problem of stealth taxes. In other words, the personal allowances being frozen. So the government still collects a lot more. So even the NIC cut, the National Insurance Contributions cut, is offset by the fact that one will have to pay more tax simply because there is a frozen personal allowance. So people are not going to feel particularly better, but they will feel better if interest rates come down, which has got nothing to do with the government at all. So one of the pledges of lowering inflation, again, was one that we all thought was going to be met simply because it was going to happen. The Bank of England didn't quite seem to agree, but all the rest of us did. And if interest rates do start coming down, for the moment, the Bank of England says they won't for a while, but I think they will because the US will be cutting, Europe will be cutting, then that will have an impact on people. And we're already seeing that confidence improving as mortgage rates have started coming down. So perhaps 2024 isn't going to be as bad as many people are forecasting because of that.
Very interesting. Peter, Matt was saying earlier to Camilla, words to the effect that people have stopped listening to the Conservatives. And it almost sounded like you had too in your last set of answers. Do you think that that's now the problem, that more or less whatever the Conservatives say, people have tuned out?
I think so. I think it's a repeat of the 1990s when Black Wednesday destroyed the Conservative reputation for economic competence. And it really didn't matter what Major did in all those years afterwards. This time it is the trust disaster, and before that, Partygate, which again just destroyed the party's reputation. And I think, again, it's going to take a generation to recover.
A generation to recover. Stay with me and I'll be reporting on that. Thank you very much to Matt Goodwin, Vicky Price and Peter Franklin. You're watching Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. After the break, I'll be speaking to the recently ousted Prime Minister of Poland on why he believes that his successor is violating the Polish constitution. Stay with us, please.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels we're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. A furious row has erupted in Poland where the new Prime Minister Donald Tusk, latterly the great bogeyman of the Brexiteers, has put the state television channel into liquidation. The move forces a change of personnel at the top of the broadcaster, which Donald Tusk accuses of propagandising for the ousted Conservative Law and Justice Party. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking to the former Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, who is rallying opposition to what he says is a violation of the Polish constitution. Before that, let's get a bit of explanation from Professor Alex Szczerbiak at the University of Sussex. Alex Szczerbiak, welcome to GB News. Is it fair to say that the state broadcaster has been showing bias towards the outgoing Conservative Law and Justice Party?
Well, there were lots of critics of the way that Polish television has been operating by bodies like the OSCE, reporters like Borders. Its critics would point to polling data, which shows the lowest ever level of trust in Polish television during the news output during the last 8 years. And they would say that it hasn't met its statutory duty to provide balanced and impartial news coverage. However, Law and Justice, the outgoing ruling party, would respond to that by saying, well, first of all, they would say that all governments have attempted to some degree at least to influence Polish television's news and current affairs output, and that bias is not unusual. Their critics in turn would say, yes, but it's been much more blatant and aggressive over the last 8 years. At which point what Law and Justice would say is, yes, but then you need to look at the media landscape as a whole. And in a media landscape, which is where the privately owned media is overwhelmingly anti-law and justice, anti-conservative, sympathetic to the liberal left, then you need, in order to provide balance, you need, they argue, a powerful counter-narrative, a powerful counter-message. So, for example, they would say that before the 2015 election, all three major Polish evening news channels put out an anti-law and justice, anti-conservative message, whereas in the previous 8 years, they would argue that the effect of a more pro-law and justice state television has actually been to provide greater choice and greater balance within the Polish media landscape as a whole.
And what is it that Donald Tusk has actually chosen to do, the new Prime Minister, and what are the chances that it will be found unconstitutional?
Well, the problem is that there's no simple legislative route to changing the management of Polish television, which is obviously what he wanted to do. And it was a top priority of theirs in the election campaign, and they moved on it within days of coming to office. They wanted to get this done before Christmas. The problem is that the body that appoints the management of Polish television is a body called the National Media Council, whose term of office ends in 2028. And in order to shorten its term of office or to replace its membership, that would have required legislation. And there is currently a president in Poland, a Law and Justice aligned president, Andrzej Duda, who could veto that legislation. And the government doesn't have the 3/5 majority in Parliament that it needs to overturn that veto, which is why they've been trying to find get-arounds. And the get-around that they've been using is trying to use commercial law, the fact that Polish television is wholly state-owned and therefore the government is the only shareholder. And they've been trying to use that, first of all, just to simply replace the management board. And then subsequently, as you say, they've put it in insolvency and they've appointed liquidators with basically the same people that they would have got to appoint the same management as the management board. Now, the problem is, as you say, this leaves them open to the charge that they are doing exactly what they accused Law and Justice of doing in the last 8 years, which is trying to short-circuit the rule of law. And it's actually made some people, even among their own supporters, who were also very, very critical of Law and Justice, very uneasy. So obviously Law and Justice is really criticising them for this. As you say, they're organising a demonstration. But there are also people, not all of them, but some people who criticise Law and Justice and are supporters of the new government, who are also very uneasy about the route that this current government has chosen.
Alex, thank you very much indeed for explaining all of that for us. And we can now speak to Mateusz Morawiecki, who was until last month the Prime Minister of Poland. Mateusz Morawiecki, welcome to GB News. Tell me your reaction to the actions of Donald Tusk with regard to the national broadcasting channel.
Good morning and thanks for having me. Well, first of all, in Poland, there is a radical violation of the law, as well as... Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
There is a radical violation of the law, as well as violent aggression against public media. And all governments could do this with applying appropriate parliamentary proceedings. There is a very clear legislative path through which Donald Tusk and his new government could have done this. Instead of this, they have chosen to use force, to use police, to liquidate public media. And they have actually deprived people, they have denied access to media channel, to news channel for millions of people. Last time when things like this happened, it was during the martial law in 1981. I remember this time very well, and only 42 years later, it happened again. So lots of people are very much surprised with this aggressive stance, aggressive violation of law by Donald Tusk.
Mateusz, people in this country are certainly very surprised. I mean, if we saw a government, closing down the BBC, we would be astonished. Just tell me, what does this tell us about the state of institutions in Poland? What does it tell us about the state of democracy in Poland? You have now been a member of the European Union for a good long time. Some of these scenes are surprising us and dismaying us very much.
When I was Prime Minister, every day Poles could watch at least 3 TV channels, and they could form their opinion based on 3 different TV channels. You need to know that most of the private media in Poland are actually biased towards liberal left part of the political scene, and this is euphemistically said. And also before 2015, public television was under Tusk government, very much biased as well. So the fact of the matter was that the public media presented a different point of view, and this is what democracy is about. Right now, the new government, which is formed by several parties, predominantly leftist and liberal parties, is trying to monopolize media altogether, because including the public media into the same pot of media as they have been presenting last couple of years, is really depriving people of different points of view. And this is why many people in Poland are very much against it, are very much worried about what is going on in the sphere of media.
According to opinion polls, a majority of the population was concerned about the bias towards your party that was observed in the state broadcasting channel. I just wonder, should there not be an assumption that the state broadcaster is neutral and balanced? We try to do this in this country. Of course, it's a subject of constant debate as to whether the BBC achieves that. But at least it is understood that the objective of the state broadcaster is to be balanced. Can that not be achieved in Poland?
The word balanced is critically important, Michael. This is why, in the previous 8 years, the public television was presenting a different point of view than 70 or 80% of the media in Poland, and this is called balanced approach. I'm not saying public media was perfect, far from it, but it was at least presenting a different or sometimes completely different point of view than majority of liberal leftist media, which are dominant in Poland. So if you want to have a balance, and all Democrats should desire such a state, you would want to see different points of view. And right now, after this recent violation of law and radical attack on public media, you will have only one point of view. And this is clearly seen already through the public media governed by Tusk.
What about the reputational point here for Poland? I mean, for the moment, Poland is attracting a great deal of global attention over this matter. But is this really the sort of thing for which you want Poland to receive attention? The shutting down of the state broadcasting channel, is that the sort of advertisement that Poland wants to send out?
It's a very bad development of matters, and I regret it. I regret also to emphasize that this is similar to what Lukashenko and Putin are doing. They want to monopolize their access to information. Of course, I don't want Poland to be, discussed by the others from the point of view of violation of law and breaching constitution, which clearly Tusk government is doing. This is also why we are not complaining to international institutions at all. We want the public opinion in other countries to be aware of what is going on in my country. But as opposite to what the current government was doing while in opposition several years ago. We are not complaining to the European Commission, to the European Court of Justice, or other institutional bodies, because what is happening in Poland should be dealt with in Poland. This is my view. You might remember, Michael, the Article 7, rule of law, and so on. And it was appalling that Civic Platform under Tusk was complaining and voting against Poland, was complaining to the European Parliament, and was voting in favor of imposing sanctions on Poland. We are not doing these things. We call for protest, and on the 11th of January there will be protests on the streets of Warsaw because many people, also not supporting Law and Justice Party, are appalled with what is going on in Poland right now around public media.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mateusz Morawiecki, who was until very recently Prime Minister of Poland before being replaced by Donald Tusk. In the United Kingdom, our own state broadcaster continues to face questions over its handling of the Martin Bashir scandal. The journalist was found to have used fake bank statements to secure his famous interview with Princess Diana, convincing her that members of the royal family were paying to have her spied upon. Now lawyers for the BBC say that it will redact hundreds of emails concerning the controversy that are due to be released under the Freedom of Information Act. Let's speak to Nicholas Owen, who broadcast for the BBC for decades and was also royal correspondent at ITV. Nicholas, Happy New Year to you. Very good to see you. Welcome back to GB News. What do you make of the developments? We've had so many long-running sagas that we've been talking about this morning. For example, what's going on with the sub-postmasters. Here is another long-running saga, a scandal which is decades old, which has still not been resolved. And by the way, we seem to be dealing with the same themes of cover-up and the use of vast amounts of public money to employ lawyers to make sure that if we ever get to the truth, it will be too late.
Well, Happy New Year to you as well, Michael. Yeah, it's a very tricky situation, isn't it? Martin Bashir conducted that famous interview. Actually, I was working at the time, I remember, for the opposition, for ITN, and News at 10 was on the air at the same time as this interview. You see it being done here. And it was a very fraught night for me. I had to dodge backwards and forwards trying to find out what was being said and producing bits of snippet of news on the air. And Trevor McDonald was reading the bulletin, and it was. I remember it so terribly well. And of course, we all said, "What an incredible scoop! What an incredible scoop!" So many storylines came out of it, particularly the business about there being three of us in a marriage, as the princess said. But my goodness, how the waters have been muddied since. And I think we should be very sort of straightforward and clear about one thing: is that the interview was clearly got on a very, very dodgy and tricky basis. But you don't do anything at the BBC, Michael. You don't do anything at the BBC of any importance at all without an awful lot of people getting involved in the process of monitoring what's going on, who you're going to talk to, what you're going to ask them about, and all that sort of thing. Any major interview. So an awful lot of people would have been involved in this. And I can't help feeling that at the back of this, there's a lot of reputations of some very, very high-profile people in the BBC, very important people and so on. It's an extremely sensitive issue. They're going to see themselves as exposed into how management actually acted in all these situations. Jolly tricky. Now, is there a sort of malign cover-up going on? Are there people sort of sitting there saying, "God, we can't have this, we can't have that, we can't have the other"? Well, you know as well as I do, once lawyers start sitting around a table and looking at anything, particularly when it's stacks and stacks of emails, we now seem to be stacks and stacks of WhatsApp. But I mean, in the old days, the emails was the best we could do. They are bound to say, "Well, we just really can't say that. We can't say this because that's going to affect that's going to." So I think it is not so much professional damage or potential professional damage that people are trying to cover up here. That they're trying to sort of sort out a very cumbersome system which militates against sort of good basic journalism, really. And I think that's at the heart of this issue.
That is an interesting gloss, Nicholas. I mean, it's worth remembering that this has already been looked into and the BBC has been condemned for what happened and for its actions, that there has already been from official sources who looked into this, I think it was a High Court judge, there's already been very severe criticism of Tony Hall, who later became Director General, who supposedly looked into the allegations against Martin Bashir. That inquiry was found to have been absolutely inadequate for the circumstances and, of course, didn't get to the truth. So it's not as though we're now talking about managerial procedures in the BBC. We've already established that something very wrong was done that has already been very roundly criticised.
Yeah, I accept that. I accept that entirely. There's no doubt at all that people didn't do as good a job as they should have done, and I'm not trying to get away from that at all. And I'm trying to defend the BBC in this at all. It was astonishing that a man like Martin Bashir, who, when looked into his record generally, they'd have looked back at other things that he'd done and taken that into account at the time. You'd have thought they'd have been a bit more cautious about everything else. Yeah, I'm not suggesting it's just managerial procedure. Obviously, reputations are at stake as well. But I'm saying to you, lawyers going through these things, they're going to be looking at all this details of everything. A lot of things get redacted because they are all about personal phone numbers and contacts and so on, which of course shouldn't really leak into the public arena, and one understands that. But I'm not defending BBC at all on this one. I think it's astonishing what has been discovered about the way that Martin Bashir went about getting that interview has been breathtaking. Very, very unfortunate, really, because it has done so much damage. Not just to the BBC, but to the sort of whole idea that there can be sort of responsible journalism covering a subject as tricky and as awkward as I remember only too well, the royal family. Very, very difficult to get behind the scenes to really find out what is going on. And what the Diana interview did and all the fuss that it has caused since and the allegations going backwards and forwards about how it was obtained and so on has made dealing with the royal family for journalists who have to do it today so much more difficult. It's become extremely unusual to get really behind the scenes of the royal family at all. The one exception being lately, of course, was the wonderful Newsnight and Emily Maitlis scoop when Prince Andrew was so very successfully skewered, it must be said. But that's been an exception. It has made things terribly tense and difficult on both sides, and I think to the detriment both of the BBC, journalism in general, and indeed the royal family as well. I don't think it's done them any favours either.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas Owen. Good to see you again. After the break, I'll be joined in the studio by a barrister and chair of Lawyers for Israel, who will explain why that country, which has spent decades boycotting the International Court of Justice, will now fight its case against accusations of genocide during the war in Gaza.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Israel surprised international observers this week by announcing that it will engage with the International Court of Justice to defend against accusations of genocide made by South Africa. Israel has typically refused to appear before the ICJ, but has denounced the accusations by South Africa as a blood libel. Hamas killed more than 1,200 Israelis in their attack in October last year, whilst the ongoing Israeli operation against them in Gaza has claimed the lives of 22,000 people, according to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. To help to explain the legal nuances involved in this dispute, I'm joined by barrister and chair of Lawyers for Israel, Natasha Hausdorff. Happy New Year and welcome back to GB News.
Happy New Year.
I imagine some of this must depend on a definition of genocide. One must exist, I assume.
Indeed, and we find that in Article 2 of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that is, in particular, the reason, the existence of this treaty dating from 1948, which Israel is a party to, that has underpinned Israel's involvement in this case. It may therefore not be surprising to many lawyers that if Israel is engaging in the hearings that will be taking place in The Hague this week on Thursday and Friday, because unlike any previous case that has been brought, for example, applications for advisory opinions, which are not legally binding and in which Israel has declined to participate, this is a contentious case which is being brought by South Africa based upon that treaty, and that's the basis upon which Israel has said we will be engaging and we will be calling out this baseless accusation.
The definition of genocide has to do with the elimination of a people, making efforts to ensure that they don't exist. Is that right? Is that what the definition is about? That's absolutely right. And it's at its heart, Michael, is the intention to destroy a group as such, an ethnic, religious or racial group. The phrase, of course, was famously coined by Raphael Lemkin in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it was developed to be able to describe that intention to destroy a group. In that case, of course, it was the Jewish people that were targeted by the Nazis throughout the Holocaust. So the fact that this term developed in order to describe that appalling crime of genocide perpetrated against the Jewish people, the fact that the tables have been turned to such an extent and the victims, essentially, of a genocide that was perpetrated again
against Jews on the 7th of October by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organisations. The fact that this term, coined by Lemkin after the Holocaust, again on display on the 7th of October, would now be being used against the victims in this case is pretty extraordinary.
What will the defence be? Some people will say, look, 22,000 people, possibly, allegedly, have been killed in Gaza. This sounds like a very large number of casualties. What is the Israeli defence if that doesn't constitute genocide?
Well, what you haven't been able to say is how many out of those 22,000 were in fact Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists. According to Israel...
Let's say it's half.
Well...
How would the defence continue beyond that point?
Well, that's a very important factor, one that we're not clear on as yet. But the current estimates of the civilian to combatant casualty ratio in the Gaza war are 2 to 1. Now, compared to a global average of casualties in urban warfare contexts, and these are statistics put out by the United Nations, globally, we're looking at a 9 to 1 civilian to combatant casualty ratio. So the 2 to 1 ratio that is currently estimated on the basis of very limited information, we have to caveat, is unparalleled in the history of urban warfare. That puts the lie to any suggestion that international law is being violated in terms of the broader international humanitarian law. But the crime of genocide is well over and above that. And we're dealing, as I indicated, specifically with the intention to eradicate a group. It's difficult to express how bogus and divorced from reality that suggestion is in this context.
I mean, I assume the Israelis will actually go further even than you've just said, if I may say so, in that they will argue, first of all, that they have tried to conduct precision strikes, but also that aid has been moving into Gaza. I mean, the people of Gaza have gone through a terrible, terrible time, but they have not starved en masse because aid has got through.
And that is principally because, amongst other things, Israel's opened the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is the main crossing point from Israel into Gaza. Of course, aid getting in through Egypt has been subject to stricter controls. And COGAT, which is the organisation in the Israeli army responsible for humanitarian provisions, has also been clear that their rate of inspecting aid surpasses at the moment the rate at which humanitarian organisations are able to get aid into Gaza. So Israel has been, again, going over and above, certainly requirements of international law, but also what it can possibly do to contribute to the provision of aid for the civilians in Gaza. And that's in parallel with, as you say, the precision strikes, coupled with warnings, coupled with more measures than any other army has taken in the history of warfare to prevent civilian casualties in Gaza. And even the United States has recognised that the IDF has gone further than the US Army might very well in those circumstances.
The United States has been entirely contemptuous of this South African bid to call this genocide. Why is it South Africa that has brought this case?
Well, unfortunately, South Africa has a long history of promoting libels against the Jewish state. You'll be aware, of course, of the conferences in Durban, the Zionism is Racism resolutions, a shameful part of the history of the United Nations. We've also seen a continuous support from South Africa for the Hamas leadership, telephone calls that took place even after the 7th of October massacre. And it seems not one word of condemnation from the South African government of that until this brief in which there has been a nod to that. We've also seen South Africa's support for other terrorists in the past, Muammar Gaddafi, amongst others, and of course now its deepening relationship with the Iranian regime. So support for terrorism is nothing new. The reason that the United States' condemnation of this is so critical is because what South Africa is applying for is essentially a provisional measure that the court order Israel to stop its defence, its actions, military campaign against some 40,000 Hamas terrorists. And that has implications for all law-abiding states, the US, the UK included. And we should be hearing more from those law-abiding countries against this initiative.
Thank you very much, Natasha Hausdorff. Well, that concludes the first hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. I will be back in a few minutes to discuss whether the West should take military action against the Houthis of Yemen. And I'll be discussing the resignation of the Harvard president, Claudine Gay. So all of that will be in the afternoon. Stay with me until then, please. Thank you.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar. sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather. It's a cold start this morning across the country, some frost, fog and icy stretches in places, but it will be largely dry, plenty of sunny spells as we go through the day. We will have this area of cloud though, bringing some showers in across northeast England. Could be sleet and snow over the higher ground here. And also some wintry showers affecting Kent through the day, but they should ease as we move through into the afternoon. But for many, plenty of sunshine. A few fog patches perhaps lingering southern Scotland, Northern Ireland, but mostly clearing. And temperatures on the cold side, 2 to 5 Celsius for many, perhaps 6 or 7 around a few coastal stretches. And then as we move into the evening time, temperatures fall away quickly. We'll see well below freezing across northern and western areas. Thicker clouds still moving in from the North Sea, affecting parts of northern England, perhaps stretching into Wales, the Midlands and southeast England at times. 1 or 2 wintry showers possible from this. Icy stretches developing widely again due to the wet ground as temperatures fall close to or below freezing. Some fog patches once more to take us into Monday morning. Another cold start of widespread frost, and then through the day, largely dry, plenty of sunny spells developing once mist and fog patches clear. A few wintry showers possible in the easterly breeze, which does pick up as the day goes on, turning quite brisk, so feeling quite cold. Temperatures generally below average, 4 or 5 Celsius, but feeling nearer to freezing. See you soon.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. In our first programme of the new year, we're bringing you up to speed with the latest news that's shaping the world in 2024. We'll start with a debate on how the West should deal with threats to international shipping entering the Red Sea. For months, Houthi rebels, who control much of Yemen, have been attacking vessels as they pass through the narrow Bab al-Mandab Straits. Former British Army officer Colonel Richard Kemp will join me. Later in the programme, we'll discuss whether Britain has the capacity to police those waters as the Royal Navy faces a recruitment crisis. Reports in the Daily Telegraph say that warships are being decommissioned as there aren't enough sailors to crew them, while the service has been forced to advertise for a Rear Admiral on LinkedIn. Chris Parry, who held the rank of Rear Admiral himself, will join us. And across the pond, the fallout from a disastrous congressional hearing with the leaders of three of America's most prestigious universities continued last week with the resignation of Harvard President Claudine Gay. Gay was denounced for telling Congress that context was important in determining whether calling for the genocide of Jews violated Harvard's code of conduct. Since then, she's also faced multiple accusations of plagiarism. I'm joined by social scientist Eric Kaufman, who was previously a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. All of that to come, but first your news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon. It is just after midday, and I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. The UK's Health Security Agency has issued an amber cold health alert for parts of England until Friday afternoon. Over 200 flood alerts are still in place across England, with rivers still rising. The Prime Minister has, a little earlier, met residents affected by flooding in Oxford.
There have been many people affected by what's happened over the past week, but also 49,000 homes have been protected from flooding as a result of that investment, and also things like the pumps that I've been seeing here today and the flood barriers. Just in the community I've been walking around, hundreds of homes have been protected because of those investments. But of course this is going to be devastating for those who are impacted, which is why there's financial support in place. But overall, the investment that's going into flood defences is at a very, very high level.
Well, a little earlier today, the Prime Minister denied having hesitations about the government's Rwanda scheme during his term as Chancellor. The BBC claims to have seen documents where Rishi Sunak expressed scepticism about the plan, stating that the deterrent won't work. The Prime Minister said it was his job to ask probing questions about every policy that came across his desk. Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, says the Prime Minister's plan is the deterrent the UK needs.
I am sure that he was asking a lot of questions about the policy, but look at his actions, look what he's done. You know, he's introduced the illegal migration bill into the House of Commons, the Rwanda bill, which will introduce Rwanda to this country and will mean that we overturn the issues that were raised by the Court of Appeal. It will mean that flights can take off to Rwanda, which we think is incredibly important because we know deterrence works. We've seen what happened with the Albania deal, where they do get returned to their country of origin.
However, Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson says the plan won't work.
It's far from clear whether the plan will have sent anyone to Rwanda because, you know, we've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than we have asylum seekers. And even if Rwanda were to be an effective intervention, well, even if it were to be effective, you're talking about between 100 to 200 asylum seekers. It's 1% of the backlog of claims that we're facing at the moment. So it's just not the answer. It's a gimmick. What we need to have is a serious plan, as Labour has set out, around tackling those cases, that huge backlog of cases, and ending the use of inappropriate accommodations such as hotels.
A watchdog is looking into claims that Pensions Minister Paul Maynard used taxpayer money for Conservative Party campaigning. A report also revealed that donors to the party had to deposit contributions to Mr Maynard's personal account rather than the constituency association. The Lib Dems are urging the Prime Minister to remove him as minister while the allegations are investigated. The Blackpool North and Cleveland's MP denies the claims. Cash and drugs worth £350,000 have been recovered from a car in County Down. It's after officers stopped and searched a vehicle travelling along the A1 between Hillsborough and Dromore yesterday. A 24-year-old man and a 21-year-old woman were arrested on suspicion of possessing criminal property and possession of drugs with intent to supply. Dozens of planes have been grounded in America after a window and part of the fuselage blew out of an Alaska Airlines plane in mid-air. The aircraft was forced to make an emergency landing after a hole appeared where the emergency exit had been. 177 people were on board, but no one's been hurt. The US airline regulator has ordered inspections of 171 Boeing 737 MAX 9 jets. The UK's Civil Aviation Authority has confirmed that the aircraft are not registered in the UK. A probe carrying British technology is preparing to blast off into space tomorrow in what could be a first for a private company. The Peregrine Mission 1, built by the US space company Astrobotic, will attempt to land on the lunar surface. The spacecraft is set to be one of the first US moon landings since the final Apollo mission more than 50 years ago. On board will be a sensor developed by UK scientists, which will analyse the thin lunar atmosphere and find out more about how water might be moving around the moon. Back here on Earth, this is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Pip Thompson. Ever since the October 7th attacks on Israel and Israel's military campaign in Gaza, ships travelling through the Red Sea have come under attack. The aggression is from a group called the Houthis. They're rebels against the Yemeni government, who control large parts of that country, and they're backed by Iran. They're opposed to Israel, and they say they'll continue to target international shipping until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. Since mid-November, Houthis have launched more than 20 drones and missiles at ships off the Yemeni coast. Now the United States is putting together a military coalition to stop the attacks. To debate whether military action should be taken against the Houthis, I'm joined by a former officer in the British Army, Colonel Richard Kemp, and Aaron Bastani, founder of Novara Media. Richard Kemp, first of all, what action do you think is open to the Allies, the United States, Britain, and possibly others, that could be taken against the Houthi aggression?
Well, of course, there's two main types of military action that could be applied here. One is defensive action, in other words, having warships and other resources in the Red Sea to intercept missiles and drones that are fired at shipping and indeed to deal with small boat attacks, which we've seen as well from the Houthis. This is not like the Somali pirates who carried out a similar kind of campaign of attack a number of years ago and were pretty much defeated by this kind of defensive measure. This is rather different, as we can see in the footage now. That the Houthis use helicopters, they use very sophisticated, precise missiles, and so it's not going to be easy to, I don't think, defeat them purely by defensive measures. So the next alternative is to carry out aggressive attacks against the Houthis inside Yemen, and that could include targeting commanders. It could include attacking missile sites and other military locations that are used against Red Sea shipping. Obviously, that's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's something that certainly should be considered in this case if we're to reopen the Red Sea and the access to the Suez Canal, which is vitally important for international trade.
The United States commentator and former government official John Bolton, of course, urges that we should go further. What he says basically is that this, and indeed Hamas, and indeed Hezbollah, and a number of other organisations are basically doing the bidding of Iran, and that if we want to bring any kind of tranquility to the Middle East, says, Bolton, you need to go after Iran. You have to have regime change in Tehran. Richard Kemp, what do you make of that?
Well, I think he's absolutely right. All of these groups that are attacking Israel and international targets as well, including US military targets, are groups that are sponsored, funded, armed, and to varying degrees directed by Iran. And that includes Lebanese Hezbollah in the north, it includes Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, it includes Shiite militias in Syria, it includes militias inside Iraq, and of course it includes the Houthis. So there's one kind of head that needs to be attacked in this case, as well as dealing with the individual limbs, and that of course is Tehran. Now, so far the US, for many years now, certainly since President Biden took office, the US has been doing everything it can to appease Iran, including unfreezing assets, which are then used, of course, to not only to fund its aggression in the Middle East, but also to help Iran to supply vast numbers of drones to kill civilians in Ukraine by the Russians. So this is a major problem that needs to be dealt with. I think we need to move from appeasement, certainly, to a very, very harsh sanctions regime as a minimum against Iran. And we have seen signs of the US fighting back against this after a long period of very weak response to attacks on their own forces. For example, since the war in Israel, in Gaza began 3 months ago, there have been over 100 Iranian-directed militia attacks on US forces in Syria and in Iraq. And only recently have we seen a really robust response when a US drone strike took out the leader of one of the militias in Baghdad.
Aaron Bastani, thank you for your patience. Let's turn to you now. What do you make of this idea that what needs to happen is that we should take on Tehran, we should take on Iran?
Well, firstly, I think there's a lot that I agree with what Richard Kemp just said there. I mean, clearly you want a pacified Red Sea, you want open commercial sea lanes. We all agree on that. Then the question is, well, with regards to the Houthis, what's the appropriate course of action? I would say it would be a very bad idea to engage in aggressive measures without a broader strategy. What are Britain's interests in the region? What is our strategy? And what are the guiding principles? Because those are precisely the questions we failed to ask at the start of the 21st century. And dare I say, that's actually why the situation is now so bad. Because Iranian influence in West Asia was nothing, effectively, beyond its own borders until the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Something similar happened, by the way, in Yemen after 2015 when the Saudis went to war with the Houthis. That's also when the Iranians managed to create a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula. So amongst the chaos and volatility of war, actually, the net beneficiaries in West Asia over the last 20 years have been the Iranians. So if you care about this, I think we need to tread very lightly. In terms of war with Iran, I think people don't necessarily realize the scale of what that means. You know, this is a country of 90 million people, a surface area, land area, equivalent to France, Germany, and Ukraine combined, 3 times the size of Iraq. It has precision-guided missiles, many decent medium-range missiles, loitering munitions, very impressive extraterritorial special forces, proxies across the region. A regime can be bad and doing bad stuff, but that doesn't mean you therefore take the most aggressive action against them, because it can be counterproductive. Again, as we've seen over the last 20 years. Nobody thought Saddam was a good guy, but on reflection, what we did was probably unwise. It certainly didn't help our interests in the Middle East. So
Aaron,
in terms of the attack, please.
Aaron, I was just going to ask you if you could answer your own questions at the beginning there. What are our interests? How would you define our interests? And how would you define the strategy that follows from those interests?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think, and that's where I think we can probably agree. So I would say the interests are: we want to guarantee the free movement of goods. We want energy prices to be as cheap as possible, certainly not subject to massive political crises or embargoes on the West of oil. And we want to minimize the number of displaced people, the number of refugees in West Asia, because of course they can come to Europe. And that's a major issue for electorates across the continent. Those would be the 3 things for me. So any policy that we undertake, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Iran, I would ask those questions. Will it create refugees? Will it create energy inflation? And will it help create a more stable sort of global situation? Now, on that final point of the stable global situation, I can see Richard's logic. On the energy inflation, on the refugees, I can't. And I think that has to be explained to people because, look, we had a lot of energy inflation last year, and we have to be honest about this. War with Iran would make last year's energy inflation look like a picnic.
Richard, let's go back to you. Supposing, let's go to a medium-range sort of response. Let's assume that a coalition takes on some of the facilities in Yemen, so some of the rocket launching facilities and so on, which are manned by the Houthis. What do you imagine would happen next? What would be the response to that? Because presumably such a military action would bring about its consequences.
Well, I think it's easy to be frightened by the prospect of taking more severe military action than we've been taking so far. It's easy to kind of be deterred by the possibility of an Iranian reaction. But I think what we've seen historically is when Iran receives the kind of medicine it tries to dish out, it tends often to back down. And we've already seen, I think, since the attack by the US on the Iraqi militia leader in Baghdad, we've already seen signs behind the scenes of Ayatollah Khomeini sort of suggesting that we're not interested in war with the US. So I think it's, there's a saying that weakness provokes and deterrence prevents, and I think that applies here as well. And I think we can look at it more widely in as much as it may be that, and of course no one can predict the outcomes of these things, it may be that a significant hit against the Houthis or hits could well deter Iran from further aggression in Lebanon. For example, they've been carrying out very, very intensive strikes against the Israeli civilians and military using Hezbollah proxies in Lebanon. And that threatens, it really does threaten very badly to develop into a major campaign between Israel and Hezbollah in the north. That obviously should be avoided if it possibly can be. And it may be that deterring Iran from directing such a war by Hezbollah could be the product of US resolve against the Houthis.
Another set of very difficult decisions for policymakers. Thank you very much to Aaron Bastani and Colonel Richard Kemp. Later in the programme, I'll be joined by Rear Admiral Chris Parry to discuss the Royal Navy's recruitment crisis that could jeopardise British missions in the Red Sea and elsewhere. Stay with us for that, please.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Claudine Gay has become the shortest-serving president of Harvard in the university's history after resigning on Tuesday. She came under fire after a congressional hearing last year in which she said that a call for genocide of Jewish peoples might or might not violate Harvard's code of conduct, depending on the context. Later, she faced multiple accusations of plagiarism, evidence in her publications. In a moment, I'll be speaking to someone very familiar with her work, the social scientist Eric Kaufman, who's with me in the studio. But before that, to discuss how this relates to the fevered debate on free speech in universities in the United States, I'm joined by Nico Perino from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Nico, welcome to GB News. Thank you very much for joining us. There are some league tables on freedom of speech in United States universities, and I believe that Harvard comes bottom or just about bottom. Can you describe those league tables, the sorts of things that are being looked at, and why Harvard is doing so poorly?
Yeah, Harvard in FIRE's college free speech rankings this year came dead last. And the school that was right before it on those rankings was the University of Pennsylvania, which finds itself also in hot water at the moment. But the methodology for these rankings is pretty simple. We go out and we ask a representative sample at all of the colleges, a representative sample of students, what they think of their campus environment along a number of different matrices. Do they think the administration would support free speech on their campus? How do they think about controversial speech or speakers on their campus? Would they be likely to disrupt these campuses? And Harvard came near the bottom on all of these different variables. We also take a look at the cases that we've seen at these campuses and incorporate those into the rankings. And also, we look at the policies. Do these colleges and universities have policies that are protective of free speech? And Harvard, for the first time in the 3 years that we have done these rankings, came in at dead last. And it wasn't really a surprise to us. And in fact, if you look at this controversy with Claudine Gay, you can see examples of how Harvard looks at free speech and a free press. So for example, when the allegations first started being investigated by the New York Post in October, Harvard sent its outside counsel to the New York Post, had an angry lawyer letter sent to them, threatening to sue them for, quote, immense damages if it continued with its investigations and published the results. But as we've seen in the past month or so, there are serious allegations against Claudine Gay for plagiarism. The thing that did her in, according to New York Times reporting this week, was an October 19th letter that detailed 40 allegations of plagiarism against Claudine Gay. And ultimately, as we've seen in the reporting, it was an October 27th call with Claudine Gay, where the decision was made that she was going to resign.
Let's go back, Nico, to the freedom of speech issue. What are the sorts of things that have earned Harvard its position right at the bottom of the freedom of speech league table?
Well, it is the fact that students at Harvard do not believe that they can express themselves. It is also what Harvard has done to some key faculty on the campus. So if you look at Carol Hooven, who was a lecturer at Harvard, published a book called Testosterone, appeared on Fox News to discuss that book, believes that biological sex is real. She was driven out of Harvard for her views on this topic. An academic should be able to discuss these things. And if you're looking at Claudine Gay, in fact, as she was overseeing a portion of the college in her role as dean prior to her becoming president of Harvard, she helped drive out Ronald Sullivan, who is still a professor there, but was a master of one of the kind of residential colleges, and was involved as a defense attorney for Harvey Weinstein. And students were protesting his involvement in that defense. And here in America, we have a very long and robust tradition of upholding due process rights for those accused of even the worst crimes. And that it's important that we have criminal defense attorneys that are willing to step up and defend people who are accused of heinous crimes. And for doing his job, in this case, Ronald Sullivan, he lost a key role at the university. And in fact, when Claudine Gay did resign a few short hours later, Ronald Sullivan tweeted out one word: karma.
Thank you very much indeed, Nico Perino. A rather grim view of what's going on at Harvard. Well, let's now turn to Professor Eric Kaufmann, who is president at the University of Buckingham. But you were at the Harvard Kennedy School, and did that mean that you were close by Claudine Gay? Did you know about her? Did you have some vision of the work that she was doing?
Well, I didn't. Although I was a political scientist like Claudine Gay, I was in the same association, the American Political Science Association, and I did present to the graduate students of Gary King, who was also her advisor. So I suppose in that sense, I was probably a couple of steps removed. If you look at her work, again, if you compare to previous Harvard presidents, she has very few publications. There were Harvard presidents that published more in a year than she did in her entire career. But more seriously, she's got over 40 instances of plagiarism, lifting entire paragraphs and dropping them into her text without attribution. These are things that students would be failed for. She's doing that as the president of an institution. But I think this actually speaks to a deeper issue, which is the corruption, in a way, of higher education, not only in the U.S., but across the West. A shift from an emphasis on what I would call cultural liberalism, that is, equal treatment, freedom of speech, objective truth, scientific method, towards cultural socialism, equal outcomes for minority groups compared to majority groups, and also harm protection, emotional harm protection from speech you don't like. And what the second means is you're going to abrogate free speech rights, the pursuit of truth, in order to achieve these equality aims. And that's kind of what Claudine Gay does, and her hiring and promotion as president on the basis of skin color, gender, a weak publication record, I think exemplifies this problem.
Harvard's motto, I think, is veritas, truth. So you think it's moved some distance from the truth?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you espouse, as Carol Hooven, who was just mentioned, if you say that I believe biological sex and gender are connected, and a woman is biologically this way and not that way, then you are forced out of your institution. So you've stated a truth. Now, people can dispute that. That's freedom of speech, that's academic freedom. But under the new regime where, it's equal outcomes and emotional harm protection come first, truth, academic freedom comes second, then that trumps the other, and therefore she's gone. And so that's what I mean, is that the entire truth-seeking mission, the veritas, has become corrupted in favor of what I call cultural socialism, others call social justice, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, which means diversity and equity means equal outcomes. Inclusion means we're going to protect you from speech you don't like. And that is really the ethos of the new university. So Claudine Gay was promoted. She pushed these ideas. She wanted to decolonize curriculum, rename things, check over curricula, hire and promote people on the basis of skin color and gender. That is the emphasis. And that's ultimately what led to some of these violations under the fire speech code. So, for example, firing people because they say things that are going against the DEI orthodoxy.
And what about the catastrophe at the congressional hearing? I mean, I've been turning over in my mind, it was being argued that it would be a matter of context as to whether calling for the genocide of the Jews would be against the Harvard Code. I assume it would not be a matter of context if you called for the genocide of Asian people, white people, black people, or almost any other people that one can think of. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I think if it was a genocide of white people, there would be no repercussions at all. But, you know, if you called for the genocide of black people, yeah, I mean, you'd be out. And that's, I think, the point is not, you know, in some ways, just on the face of it, if Harvard had been like the University of Chicago and had been politically neutral, defended free speech, letter of the law, then people might say, okay, they're being consistent. But when Harvard is bottom out of 254 institutions on academic freedom and then tries to defend itself and say, oh, no, we believe in free speech, which is why we don't think that calling for genocide of the Jews is an offense. The hypocrisy, that's really the problem. It's not the principle. In a way, a lot of people might say, okay, it's First Amendment right, it's within the law, fine. But, of course, that standard wasn't applied to a whole bunch of other people when it came to the favored sacred totems of the progressive left around race, gender, and sexuality.
Hundreds of academics came out in favour of Claudine Gay. Right. Does that mean that changing the president will change nothing?
My belief is changing the president will change nothing. I'm sorry to say, but the culture is too deeply ingrained. The administration is too deeply saturated in this new DEI stroke cultural socialist ideology.
Spell out DEI. Not everybody knows what DEI is.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So this is about, again, equal outcomes by minority group versus majorities, and inclusion means we're going to protect you from any speech harms that might offend you because that might make you feel unsafe, quote. And that just means that we're going to shut down people's freedom of speech, like Carol Hooven, who says, you know, I believe in biological sex. And so this is the sort of place we're in right now, and I'm afraid, despite the departure of Claudine Gay, I don't think we're going to go to a much better place.
You found a place of safety, a haven, at the University of Buckingham.
Right.
You had to escape another institution to arrive there. And tell me about the work that you are doing there.
Well, so I'm teaching a course on woke, for example, and this is something that should be taught in regular universities. It's all over the press. A lot of people are interested in it. But, of course, teaching a course on woke goes against the orthodoxy, the sort of cultural socialist orthodoxy that now prevails in universities. And so what I've done at Buckingham is to say, well, here's a relatively safe place where, in fact, we can explore ideas that should be explored, because that's really the point, is that universities are not doing their job of pursuing truth wherever it leads. They pursue truth, but if it comes up to a red line set by the ideology, they don't cross that line. What I'm doing is I'm going across that line and saying, no, we're going to pursue truth where it leads, pursue academic freedom where it leads, without the constraint of orthodoxy.
And as a scholar of wokery, you may be the best qualified person in the world to answer this, has it reached its high water mark?
It's had a peak in 2020, 2021. It's come down a little bit. We have a number of very good indicators, but it is still very entrenched, and I don't believe it's going away, in part because the younger generation is really almost twice as intolerant on a lot of these ideas as the older generation. And as they become the median academic, we're just going to see this culture become more entrenched. So I think we've got to get at the school system. Actually, I think even by the time they reach university, it's almost game over.
And Happy New Year to you too, Eric Hoffman. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking to former Rear Admiral Chris Parry about the recruitment crisis facing the Royal Navy. Before that, latest news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Michael, thank you. Good afternoon. It is 12:32. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. After being criticised for not meeting with flooding victims, the Prime Minister has been out and about talking to people in Oxford today. And he claimed they were at pains to say that the Environment Agency's response to flooding had been great. Rishi Sunak also spoke with Environment Agency workers at their depot on Osney Island as they battle rising river levels. More than 1,800 properties have been damaged by rising rivers and 200 flood alerts remain in place across England. The Met Office is warning that a drop in temperatures will lead to snow and icy conditions in some areas of England within the next 24 hours. The UK's Health Security Agency has issued an amber cold health alert for parts of England until Friday afternoon. The Prime Minister says the government's flood defences are working.
There have been many people affected by what's happened over the past week, but also 49,000 homes have been protected from flooding as a result of that investment, and also things like the pumps that I've been seeing here today and the flood barriers. Just in the community I've been walking around, hundreds of homes have been protected because of those investments. But of course this is going to be devastating for those who are impacted, which is why there's financial support in place. But overall, the investment that's going into flood defences is at a very, very high level.
Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak has denied having hesitations about the government's Rwanda scheme during his term as Chancellor. The BBC claims to have seen documents where Rishi Sunak expressed scepticism about the plan, stating that the deterrent won't work. The Prime Minister said it was his job to ask probing questions about every policy that comes across his desk. A probe carrying British technology is preparing to blast off into space tomorrow in what could be a first for a private company. The Peregrine Mission 1, built by the US space company Astrobotic, will attempt to land on the lunar surface. On board will be a sensor developed by UK scientists, which will analyse the thin lunar atmosphere and find out more about how water might be moving around the moon. Back down here, you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Pip Thompson. Several accounts in the newspapers this week suggest a crisis in recruitment facing the Royal Navy. The Daily Telegraph reports that warships will be decommissioned because there aren't enough sailors to crew them. In the Times, we read that the Royal Navy has been forced to advertise on LinkedIn for a Rear Admiral in the submarine service. Chris Parry is himself a Rear Admiral in the Royal Navy, now retired, and he joins me down the line. Chris Parry, welcome to GB News. Thank you very much for joining me. This recruitment crisis seems to be pretty severe, and it also seems to have taken the Royal Navy by surprise. I say that because we're going to decommission some ships that have just been through very expensive refits. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think it might be a surprise to the British public, but I don't think it will have been a surprise to the Royal Navy. These trends have been downwards for some time now. There are a host of reasons why that's the case. But to tell you the truth, there's an objective observer, Michael. These ships are clapped out anyway, and it's a good excuse to get rid of them. They really are on their last legs. Spending money on them to keep them going is not a very good idea.
Excuse me, Chris, we've just spent, as I understand it, hundreds of millions on them. Is the public to be told that we spend hundreds of millions and then we just get rid of them? Is that good planning?
Well, Michael, you're an ex-defence secretary. You know how this works. These sort of things pop up all the time. It's not the way I would do it. That's for sure. The Type 23 frigates are pretty long in the tooth now. I wouldn't have extended them. Somebody's made the decision that we should. I'm afraid to say all the way through the last 25 years or so, we've had ships at sea steaming up and down, pretending to do things. They haven't been doing them. They're not fit for task. And I'm afraid we've been operating at the bottom edge. Last 4 years, I'd say we're getting new ships into service, the Type 26, the Type 31, Type 32. They're turning it around at the moment, but I'm afraid these ships were well past their sell-by date. They've been going through the motions.
The programme of renewal that you just mentioned is going to take us into the next decade, into the 2030s. Meanwhile, how many surface ships are we going to have? And how many of them, this is an even better question, I think, how many of them will actually be operational at any one time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in the sort of turnover to these new ships, one thing you and I both know is ships never arrive on time either. So that's a bit of a problem. I would say we're probably having half a dozen operational ships at a time, and that's down from 30 years ago when we probably had 30 at sea in similar circumstances. They are more capable. That's the standard excuse. But frankly, you can't be in two places at once in a warship. The good news is, we're going to have 24 frigates and destroyers when the program rolls through. If you look at how many warships, submarines are under construction at the moment, there are 8 different classes under construction. But the fact of life is, Michael, the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. If we want to be interested in globalization and supporting our allies around the world in an increasingly dangerous sort of context, we're going to have to be out there. And the country is going to have to put its money where it wants its diplomatic and military mouth to be.
You've just talked about, in the medium term, having a number of extra ships, but we're talking about possibly not being able to crew the ones that we have today. What do you think is going on in terms of recruitment? Why are not enough young men and women coming forward?
Oh, there's lots of reasons, Michael. You know, we haven't got time to go into it, but basically the conditions of service have deteriorated over decades, to tell you the truth. When I joined the Navy, for example, we had subsidised accommodation, we had our own doctors and dentists, we had all sorts of reasons to differentiate us from the common mass of the population, if you like, to actually show that we did a job that was valued. At the moment, it's just another job. And we're inviting people to go to sea, do a really tough job and perform to very high standards. I used to say to my ships companies, look, we're playing at international level for our country, and yet we're not actually treating them properly at all. And everybody thinks it's a matter of pay. It isn't just a matter of pay. People want to feel proud of what they're doing. They want to be valued. And I'm afraid to say the conditions of service don't reflect that.
And what about cultural change in our society? Do you think that's playing a part?
Yeah, almost certainly. I talk to serving naval officers and ratings now, and they are beset by managerial issues, cultural issues. People seem to be more important seem to think that diversity, equality, and inclusion is more important than actually developing fighting capability. And we have to accept that diversity is a means to an end. The end is fighting capability. It's not an end in itself. And I'm afraid to say people are spending far too much time on this extraneous stuff.
Thank you very much, Rear Admiral Chris Parry. The longest strike in the history of the National Health Service now enters its 5th day, with junior doctors taking to the picket lines in a long-running dispute over pay and conditions. This comes amid hospitals pleading for junior doctors to return to work due to fears for patient safety. Several NHS trusts declared critical incidents as a result of the strike action. Our Yorkshire and Humber reporter Anna Riley has been to find out just how much support people are giving for the industrial action.
We want pay restoration. When do we want it? Now!
A new year and a new strike for junior doctors, this time lasting 6 days in the longest industrial action in NHS history. And it comes at one of the busiest times of the year as the NHS grapples with winter pressures. The dispute over pay and conditions has now entered its 10th month, with medics asking for more money to compensate for pay cuts going back to 2008.
Patients deserve doctors who are well paid, who are well rested, who are well resourced, and the UK is not providing this at the moment. 15 years of pay cuts have put our profession on its knees. So we graduate and we with hundreds of thousands of pounds of debt, and on top of it we pay thousands of pounds on a yearly basis for exams and courses. It's putting a strain on our colleagues who are simply leaving the profession.
Junior doctors were given an 8.8% pay rise last summer, with an extra 3% offered, which was rejected by the British Medical Association. And despite almost 1 million operations and appointments being cancelled due to the strike action, junior doctors here at Leeds General Infirmary feel they still have public support.
Opinion polls throughout our strike action have actually showed that public support has been increasing throughout the strike action. So I think, the public are feeling the pressure that the NHS is under as well, and I think they can empathise with the issues that doctors are facing.
Keep Our NHS Public has supported junior doctors on the picket line since strikes began in March last year.
I was a consultant in Leeds for nearly 30 years, and I believed in providing the best possible care for my patients, and I think with the state of play with the NHS at the moment, they're simply not getting the care that they should do.
A Christmas poll by Ipsos put NHS staff at the top of the nice list. But here in Leeds, there's mixed opinion on support for the junior doctors.
I couldn't do it because I'd be thinking about the patients, and that's what they should be doing, regardless of pounds, shillings and pence.
It does disturb me a little,
especially at my age, if I've got to go into hospital, is there going to be help for me there?
You know, 15 quid an hour, it's nothing for the job that you're doing. You're risking your life, you're saving people's lives. You should be expecting something better.
People are dying, which is ridiculous. And these strikes is going on and on and on.
We really need to see workers respected and treated with the dignity they deserve, and especially those in sectors like healthcare.
It's affecting me because I'm supposed to be going in and I've been delayed and I'm getting delayed again, so I'm not that happy about. Well, I do have sympathy for them, but we're all in the same boat.
The strike action will continue until 7 a.m. on Tuesday and is set to be the most disruptive in the NHS's 75 years. Anna Riley, GB News, Leeds.
Anna Riley was reporting on the junior doctors' strikes. Don't go away, as in a few minutes I'll be speaking to Baroness Caroline Cox, who's recently returned from Armenia, a country that suffered yet another traumatic year.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. Joseph Stalin continues to cast a long shadow. Just 6 days ago, on the 1st of January, a little-known entity in the Caucasus known as the Republic of Artsakh was officially dissolved. Home to over 100,000 Armenians, the territory was legally part of Azerbaijan, thanks to the perverse borders that were deliberately created during Soviet times to hobble the nationalist aspirations of the ethnic minorities inside the Soviet Empire. Last year, Azerbaijan completed a rapid military offensive to overrun the area and claim it, forcing the ethnic Armenians to flee. Baroness Caroline Cox recently visited the region, as she has done for many years, and she joins me live now. Caroline, welcome to GB News. Thank you very much for coming on. Artsakh, this name may not be very familiar to people. What is the relationship between Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, Artsakh is the name given to the land of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is part of ancient Armenia that Stalin relocated inside Azerbaijan. And Armenians have lived there for hundreds of years. But recently they've suffered at the hands of Azerbaijan, and I'd like briefly to highlight three concerns I have over my recent visit there. First, the real ethnic cleansing of the Armenians from the historic land of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh. 100,000 had to flee. I was there in the beginning, and they fled with nothing. They were desperate, and there are hardly any Armenians left in the historic land of Artsakh. So ethnic cleansing, number one. Secondly, illegal imprisonment of Armenians. Azerbaijan has abducted some of the Armenian leaders in Nagorno-Karabakh, I know some of them, and subjected them to imprisonment. They're still imprisoned illegally inside Azerbaijan. And thirdly, very briefly, attacks by Azerbaijan inside Armenian territory itself, the sovereign territory of Armenia. When I was there, a town called Goris, which is well inside Armenia itself, there was an Azerbaijan emplacement within walking distance, and another place I could see three Azerbaijan emplacements on an opposite hill. And that's invasion into Armenian territory by Azerbaijan with complete impunity.
And yet, as I understand it, Armenia and Azerbaijan have issued a joint statement. Is there any prospect at all, do you think, that some of those Armenians who have been driven out will one day be able to go back to their homes?
Well, one can hope and pray that that will be the case. They would need a lot of protection, and I would hope the UN would provide that protection, because Azerbaijan's track record of maintaining its commitments and respecting the rights of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh is a very, very dangerous record and cause of great concern. But we may hope that there will be vision for the Armenians to return to their land, because they left with nothing. They had to leave their homes, their homelands, their farms, everything, and just carry with them what they could. And they were desperate.
All of this has happened with hardly a peep of protest from the international community, from the United Kingdom or the United States, for example. This does seem to be an absolutely neglected international crisis.
Absolutely. I couldn't put it better myself. It is tragic. Azerbaijan gets away with complete impunity on these areas. And also, there's other areas where it's carrying out violations of human rights with impunity. It's abducted quite a few Armenians, and they're still abducted, and they're subjected to detention, to torture. And Azerbaijan is also carrying out incitement to attacks, hatred attacks on the cultural heritage of the Armenians who've lived there, attacks on their ancient churches. So it is a really very, very serious situation. Azerbaijan's track record is cause for concern. I could put it like that.
And the annual summit of COP, I think it's going to be COP29, the annual summit of COP always, it seems to be, looks for the most unsuitable places that it can possibly go. And it's chosen this year to go to Azerbaijan, which tends to suggest the international community is condoning what has happened.
Well, that is a cause of great concern. And I think one of my concerns is the interest that nations have in Azerbaijan, particularly the oil interests. I remember many, many years ago, I was very concerned about what was happening. I had photographs of Armenian children who'd been shattered by cluster bombs. And I took the photographs to a very senior person in the government, I can't mention names, but showed the photographs and said, will the British government make representation of the government of Azerbaijan to stop dropping cluster bombs on civilians? It's against international law. The reply, no country has an interest in other countries, only interest. We have oil interest in Azerbaijan. Good morning. I was mortified. I quoted that on the floor of the House of Lords. I obviously don't mention names, but I think it is very indicative of interest and maybe why there is such an imbalance in engagement with people violating human rights, such as Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much, Baroness Caroline Cox, a somewhat lone voice raising the cause of Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenians who've been expelled. Well, that's it from me for today, but Dawn Neeson is coming up. What's on your programme?
Good afternoon. Lovely to join you. Looking very dapper as usual, and I like to think we're coordinating. Right.
Here we are.
A vision in purples. Right, we have a cracking show coming up. We've got Sunak's latest welfare cuts. What do they really mean for people? Not very specific, was he? And should demonstrations like Just Stop Oil and the pro-Palestinian one yesterday, the die-in on Westminster Bridge, should they pay for their own policing? Interesting question. And we have a love story.
A what?
A love story.
Oh, good. Well, my programme has been rather serious-minded today, so I'm very pleased that you're going to be coming up with a love story.
A love story that involves reindeers, no less.
Oh, good. Well, a very good reason why everyone should stay tuned for Dawn Neeson, whose programme will begin here at 1 o'clock. I would like to say thank you to all my guests this morning. I will be back next Sunday. I look forward very much to that. I always appreciate people coming in on a Sunday to share their Sunday morning with us at GB News. Until I see you again, will you please have a wonderful week.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather. It's a cold start this morning across the country, some frost, fog and icy stretches in places, but it will be largely dry, plenty of sunny spells as we go through the day. We will have this area of cloud though, bringing some showers in across northeast England. Could be sleet and snow over the higher ground here. And also some wintry showers affecting Kent through the day, but they should ease as we move through into the afternoon. But for many, plenty of sunshine. A few fog patches perhaps lingering southern Scotland, Northern Ireland, but mostly clearing. And temperatures on the cold side, 2 to 5 Celsius for many, perhaps 6 or 7 around a few coastal stretches. And then as we move into the evening time, temperatures fall away quickly. We'll see well below freezing across northern and western areas. Thicker clouds still moving in from the North Sea, affecting parts of northern England, perhaps stretching into Wales, the Midlands and southeast England at times. 1 or 2 wintry showers possible from this. Icy stretches developing widely again due to the wet ground as temperatures fall close to or below freezing. Some fog patches once more to take us into Monday morning. Another cold start of widespread frost, and then through the day, largely dry, plenty of sunny spells developing once mist and fog patches clear. A few wintry showers possible in the easterly breeze, which does pick up as the day goes on, turning quite brisk, so feeling quite cold. Temperatures generally below average, 4 or 5 Celsius, but feeling nearer to freezing. See you soon.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the